I think that the Americans have made it very clear that if the Russians were to use tactical nuclear weapons, the unit that used them would be wiped out. If they did it again, the Russian army, in terms of Ukraine, at least maybe if not being wiped out, I don't know if the Americans have that capacity, but they would certainly make it very difficult for Russia to be able to use such a big army in the future.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And with the Russian presidential elections in a little over 2 weeks, Vladimir Putin, who's already the longest serving Kremlin leader since Stalin, is expected to extend his quarter-century rule and stay in power till 2030. As we approach this moment, we'll be drawing on the expertise of some of the leading analysts on Russia and the Soviet Union and the Kremlin. This time, we're joined by a lecturer and assistant professor in Russian and post-Soviet politics at the University of Bath, Dr. Stephen Hall. Dr. Hall, welcome back to Frontline. Thank you for your time. Let's start with President Putin's annual State of the Nation speech. What's your takeaway from it?
Well, I think it was very interesting in terms of what actually happened. If we remember in 2018, he was talking about ballistic missiles that could rain down on a map. He showed a map. It looked remarkably like Florida, that could rain down on, let's say, Florida, and that, it was very bellicose. Yes, there was, of course, the military rhetoric. The nuclear weapons are readied. We are a great army. We are a great power. All of this stuff that we've heard before, but it was quite short. And he actually focused more on the social aspects in terms of what Russians can expect, or more likely won't ever get, from him as his promises just before the presidential election. It was to show his domestic audience what he's going to do if they elect him, and they will, whether they want to or not, elect him as president in the March elections. It was also a way to show the West that Russia is still tough, that he is prepared to go further. And again, I think it was to try and scare Western politicians and also the West in general in terms of the fact that Russian nuclear missiles are ready.
Yeah, on those nuclear missiles, he said they have to understand that we also have weapons that can defeat them on their own territory. Of course, all this is very dangerous because it could actually trigger the use of nuclear weapons. Do they not understand that? I mean, how do you think this should be interpreted? I mean, when you hear that, do you just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, same old, same old?
To a great extent, yes. I mean, we've been hearing about nuclear blackmail since the beginning of this war, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And in fairness, we've heard it before as well. Russian state propaganda has been timing the number of seconds it takes to hit London with a nuclear missile for a fair few years now. So it is a shrug of the shoulders to a great extent. I can't imagine, I still maintain Putin will not use nuclear weapons, and that this is a bluff, and that this is what he's trying to convey to the West to try and get them to blink first.
It's interesting that the timing of the speech, or actually the timing of the release by a British national newspaper of these documents that outline the threshold for President Putin, or for Russia, using tactical battlefield nuclear weapons. So not the ones that would hit the US, for example. Is that just a kind of like convenient piece of timing, something? I mean, what do you see about that? I mean, because those details actually date back 8 to 10 years. Is that right? The information there.
I believe that's the case. I'd have to look at it again in more detail in terms of the article, but I think that there is always that possibility that they could use tactical nuclear weapons. I still maintain that is also unlikely unless the Ukrainians push Russia back to most likely into Crimea and possibly further as well. I think that the Americans have made it very clear that if the Russians were to use tactical nuclear weapons, the unit that used them would be wiped out. If they did it again, the Russian army, in terms of Ukraine, at least maybe if not being wiped out, I don't know if the Americans have that capacity, but they would certainly make it very difficult for Russia to be able to use such a big army in the future.
When you say that he's basically, this speech was designed for sending a message to the West, but also preparing for the election in just over 2 weeks. He talked a lot about Russophobia, a bit about it, and about it blinding people, and talking about dismantling of international security that he's blaming on the West, and wanting this new security arrangement for Eurasia. Do you think that those kinds of messages, that he's the one that can guarantee the safety of Russia and the Russian people against the aggressive so-called West, as he says it? I mean, do you think that message actually gets through to the Russian public?
I think to an extent it does, certainly to the older generations. Putin is still has a lot of credit, let's be honest, in the bank in terms of having made Russians better off in the 2000s. He did bring stability after the 1990s. Now, in his telling, the 1990s were a time of utter anarchy and mafia, and it was a disaster. For some Russians, it was actually okay. Yes, the mafia was there. Yes, you didn't quite know what was happening, but there was democracy. You were free to do what you wanted, and you certainly can't do that in Putin's Russia today. So I think for the older generation, Putin still has a lot of credit in the bank in terms of what he did in the early and mid 2000s. And he did make Russia stable. He did make Russia if not great power, then a regional power, certainly. He did show that the West needed to talk to Russia far more than it had done under Yeltsin. So I think it does still resonate in terms of that generation, and those are the people who are more likely to vote in elections.
And looking to the war in Ukraine, a statement made by the NATO Secretary General in the last few days, Jens Stoltenberg, he told Radio Free Europe that it would not be against international law for Ukraine to strike military targets in self-defense inside Russia. That is a change in the messaging. Why is he saying that now?
Well, I mean, that's a question you perhaps could ask him in terms of an interview. But my understanding is that, yes, it is a change in rhetoric. There's a fear that Russia and the Putin is not going to give up in terms of Ukraine. Putin did, where he didn't personally murder Navalny, but Navalny's death is on his hands, regardless of whether Navalny was killed by someone in the Russian regime or just died of a blood clot in a Russian prison. Now, there is so in that respect, he is culpable. And I think it highlights how far Putin has gone in terms of he is beyond the pale, and also in terms of the fact that when he talks about negotiations, it isn't negotiations, it's a diktat in terms of Ukraine.
Do you think, is it possible that the Secretary General is actually trying to send a sort of tacit message to countries like Germany, who are wavering or not agreeing to send their Taurus missiles, and to the US in terms of long-range ATACMS, that actually they could have the confidence to send those missiles and stop worrying about whether or not they would be used outside Ukraine?
I think they should. I think that could be one of his messages. I think it could also be a message to the Kremlin that NATO is at least starting to think about this, whereas before it was quite circumspect. Obviously, Macron slightly put the cat among the pigeons in terms of saying that French soldiers may end up in Ukraine, and everyone else said no, which again was sent a signal, I would assume, to Putin, showing that the West wasn't quite united as it should be. Stoltenberg has said something else. We shall see whether America will decide to send ATACMS, as it should have done a long time before, whether Germany will send the Taurus missiles, as it should have done a long time before. In my mind, Ukraine, if it is hitting military targets in Russia, has every right to do so, because Russia's military is coming from Russia, and it's all in order to stop the chain of command.
And on the battlefield itself, Avdiivka has fallen to Russia, and the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has been at pains to talk up some of the other relatively insignificant gains in terms of the settlements in the area. How much of this do you think is selling good news inside Russia about the way the war's going, because the election is in just over 2 weeks?
I think, I don't think many Russians knew where Avdiivka was, and I don't think many Russians really care about Avdiivka in the same way I don't think they really care too much about Donbass, if I'm honest. It is trying to show that, yes, this is a success in terms of just before the election, and it is probably one of the few successes that Putin has had this year. So you do try and play it up. In terms of what Russians think about the war, I'm still not certain that they fully support the special military operation. Putin was very clear that they do. I would like to see what information he has been told about that. I think that the Russians are, if anything, apathetic about what is happening in the war and would just like to be able to go about their daily life, which is why Putin spoke about all the social issues that he hopes to fill by 2030 when the next presidential election will happen. And if he's still alive, he will be a candidate for it.
Yes, and at the same time, President Putin, as the longer the war goes on, has very real challenges to face with the economy, with the cost of living, with keeping people on side. How is he going to achieve that? Because at the moment, you could say that all of his actions within the country are about guaranteeing the compliance of the people. How much longer do you think he can do that? And is there anything that you think the West could do to try and undermine that kind of power?
It's really a difficult thing to be talking about in terms of what the West could be doing to undermine that power, because then we're down the path of regime change, possibly like Saddam Hussein.
I think
So,
I suppose what I'm suggesting is perhaps in terms of being more proactive or finding new ways of communicating with the Russian public to counter the narrative that Putin is giving about the West, about as being a bunch of hedonistic, hypocritical people who threaten Russia itself. To actually, rather than just sort of find a different way of decrying him and telling a different story, but actually just getting the truth out.
well, absolutely. I think there's always more the West can do. One of the key things the West can do, and Google especially, Google has blacklisted a lot of Russian bloggers living abroad, in the idea that it's hard to find who is state media, who is pro-Kremlin, who isn't. Therefore, everyone is blacklisted. What the Russian diaspora could be doing, and probably have been doing, is provide a whitelist of bloggers. That would give the opposition media space. Politicians in the West could then do interviews with those bloggers, and that could be put into Russia. I'm not saying that would change Russian public opinion overnight. It probably wouldn't. But I think one of the powers that the West has is the fact that it has a Russian diaspora now in the West who have been in Russia fairly recently and still have family and are still able to communicate with that family and start to break down Putin's rhetoric about Russophobia. It's not Russophobia, it's Putinophobia. That's a completely different thing to being Russophobic. But anyway, I don't think Russophobia really exists. But it would be a way to start breaking that idea down, that narrative. You've got to do this piecemeal by segments. It's no good going in all guns blazing. It's no good trying to build up civil society and an opposition, because they will end up in jail, like Ilya Yashin, Vladimir Karamazov, and Alexei Navalny. You have to do small piecemeal initiatives and probably getting people to think about what they want to see in a future Russia is a start. And blaming Russians for the war, saying that Russians will have to go through lustration, that they will have to pay compensation for Ukraine. In an ideal world, absolutely. In an ideal world, Putin should be in The Hague. In an ideal world, lustration, they should pay compensation. But you can't tell Russian society that.
Yes, because the danger is that you you're saying that the Russian public is actually complying and supporting what is being done, whereas the alternative narrative is that actually the Russian public's being held hostage, really.
In my mind, and I appreciate this is not a popular opinion at the moment, I don't believe it's Russia's war. I still maintain it is largely Putin's war. Yes, of course, the Russian population deserves some blame for having voted Putin into power, but that's unfortunate. And yes, they do. They have acquiesced, but then you would in a highly repressive regime. The whole reason that the Putin regime has survived for so long, not the whole reason, but one of the main reasons, is that it creates an atomized society. So let's say you're Russian, okay? You don't like Putin, but you know that your parents watch state-run television, so you're not going to have a discussion with them. You also know that there is a lot of there's a lot of instances where people are passing on information about what they've heard on the street from other people. So you're not going to talk to your friends at school, in the workplace. You're not going to talk to your colleagues. You're not going to talk to your siblings, as it were, about your feelings about Putin. You're going to sit in your room. You're going to watch news, and you're going to see how repressive the police force are. So you're not going to go and walk out onto the streets in Moscow saying no to war. or I'm against Putin, because you're going to get your head kicked in. This is an atomized society. And we have to admit that not many people are very brave. I mean, even in Britain, we wouldn't see. I can't expect the majority of the population would protest en masse if, I don't know, Rishi Sunak closed down Parliament tomorrow. So the whole point is, this is a highly repressive regime, and you know that you are likely to end up in prison for a maximum of 15 years just for discrediting the Russian army as defined by the regime, and that can be anything. And so, why would you go out and do that if you assume that you're going to be the only one? What is changing is that with Boris Nadezhdin, you actually started to see, or people were able to see, they weren't alone, and that is a problem. And the Russian government has a problem in that it's trying to mobilize the society and keep it atomized at the same time. It is on a war.
Yeah, Boris Nadezhdin.
So,
Boris Nadezhdin is the man who was going
yes,
to put himself on the ballot sheet against Vladimir Putin, but then irregularities were found in the way his supporters were collated, and therefore he is no longer allowed to stand. He represented hope, didn't he? And that was the problem.
he represents hope. Whether he was, whether he was a party of the presidential administration, that remains to be seen. He almost certainly was. You wouldn't be on state media, even if you're a liberal. Although how liberal he was we don't know. But you wouldn't be on state media if you weren't tied into the regime. But he taught about hope, and more important, he said that the war is wrong. He also said Russians aren't to blame, and that was also important. And I think something the West must unfortunately have to accept about this in order to break down the connections between the regime and society. Russians cannot be shown to be blamed. And another thing that the West has to do, it needs to talk to the elite. It has to find a way through to talk to elites in the Kremlin. And this may mean that they unite behind Putin. Okay. But in an autocracy, you don't tend to see, the autocrat doesn't wake up the next morning and go, okay, I'm going to break down the system. We're going to hold free and fair elections tomorrow, and I'm going to step aside. You need to talk to the elite to try and splinter them. And even if they unite around Putin, that's fine. You've tried. But if you can get them to start splintering, start thinking about a future, that also starts to break down the regime's support. And if Putin finds out that some of his elite have spoken to, I don't know, Chris Grayling, for instance, then that starts to also create further paranoia that the Russian elite are talking to, foreign bodies. And if he doesn't find out, he will assume it's happening anyway. So he will become more repressive towards his elite. That could also lead to breakdown.
In terms of the way that President Putin is ruthless in quashing any dissenters and any critics, you mentioned some names earlier, and one of them was Vladimir Kara-Murza. It's reported now that Britain's Foreign Secretary David Cameron is meeting his wife to try and progress some kind of way of having him released. Can he actually do anything?
If Britain has something that Putin needs, there's a possibility. If Britain is able to talk to Germany and have the gentleman that I've forgotten his name, I think it's Krasnikov, who was in jail. Putin mentioned him as a great patriot in the Tucker Carlson interview. He killed a Chechen or Georgian fighter in Chechnya, in Berlin. Anyway, if David Cameron is able to get him to Moscow, there could be an exchange. But the Kremlin has started taking hostages, really. And it becomes that much harder in terms of giving Putin what he needs.
To add to those names of people who have been dealt prison sentences, this week a top human rights campaigner, 70-year-old Oleg Orlov, given a jail sentence for denouncing Russia's assault on Ukraine. In the way that he is clamping down on anybody, on any kind of free speech or any kind of criticism, what kind of society do you think Putin is trying to create for the future? Does he have a strong vision, or is it just literally about staying in power at any cost?
I think to an extent it's about staying in power at any cost, but he is trying to produce a more patriotic, in his mind, society. What is happening to the younger generation is frankly frightening in terms of the education they're receiving at school, the growth of the young army, the youth army, the young army, and across what's happening in terms of younger children. there is this sense that they are building towards something that is particularly dark. I don't want to go down the road of, labeling just fascism. Other people have. It is whatever you would like to call it. It is certainly a dark period. They're reinterpreting history. They're reinterpreting what they need in order to create a younger generation that believes that Russia is being attacked by the West, that the West is out to get Russia, and this is frightening because this, even if Putin was to lose power tomorrow, how effective this younger generation actually are, we still don't know. But if they are as if it is as bad as we suspect it to be, it's going to be frightening. And trying to change that generation as well is going to be a real effort for the future in terms of how we cope with Russia.
Do you have any thoughts on how that can be done?
Well, I think you can, to an extent, you can talking to them about the fact that the West isn't to blame for what's happened in Russia is going to be very difficult. I think the only way you can do that is to try and steer them away towards trying to build Russia in terms of making it a greater state, in terms of providing for its population. The fact that civil society organizations could help, they could create civil society organizations to help give villages in eastern Russia flushing toilets, for instance, or a gas supply, or what have you, because that would be a way to build up Russia. This is, of course, very scary ideas, and the idea of building up Russia, I know at the moment, is anathema to a lot of people. But it's how you try and deprogram this generation, and I think it's going to be a real challenge for a while.
Can I just get your opinion on something that's been in the news in recent days, which is the state state in Moldova and the region of Transnistria, which it's reported as calling for help from Moscow in the face of increased pressure. Increased tensions over the territory, and it's being reported this could be a new flashpoint. Can you just explain what you see is going on here, and if this is really true or it's actually just being talked up?
Well, I could be absolutely wrong with what I'm about to say, so I could be talking about this in a couple of days' time of how wrong I was. But I don't see it as the flashpoint it's been reported as. As far as from what I remember from having reading around the topic over the last couple of days, there has already been a declaration of Transnistria joining Moscow or joining Russia way back in the mid 2000s, which the State Duma and the Federation Council have yet to act on. If they did, then technically Transnistria would, under Russian law, become Russian tomorrow. But neither body in Parliament has done anything about it. It is, to my extent, economic support. How Russia would be able to provide economic support to Transnistria is difficult unless Russia was able to break through the Ukrainian lines. Getting supplies into Transnistria is going to be difficult. Airlifting it is going to be nigh on impossible because of all the air defence. They could send paratroopers, but again, that's a difficult situation. And Transnistria has been used, or potentially could be used, have been reports of it during the war, that it would act as a second front in the west on Ukraine. There are 2,000 Russian peacekeepers there, euphemistically called peacekeepers. But anyway, they could also start destabilization activities in Moldova as well. So Moldova and Ukraine have understandably decided to try and isolate Transnistria through an economic blockade and through other things to try and stop the potential for those 2,000 Russian soldiers to have any role in the war. If Transnistria was to invade Ukraine from the west, it would need to be supplied by Russia anyway. So it is, I would say, a difficult situation for Russia to really do anything on apart from just rhetoric.
The last time we spoke, you were confident that Ukraine would ultimately win this war. Do you still think that way? And how much longer do you think President Putin can continue with this unprecedented spending on defence?
Well, I think I'm not an economist, so it's hard for me to say in terms of the economy. I think it's overheating. The difficulty is for Putin is that he needs to maintain this war in order to keep the support, because when Russians realise how many have died, if they ever do, then it's going to destroy his support. So maintaining the war is a face-saving way of him not having to deal with the future. At the same time, he also needs to try and maintain people's well-being in terms of maybe not having the latest Apple or the latest Mercedes, but at least making them not much worse off than they already are. So it's a difficult balancing act, and so far the Russian economy has done quite well on that. I still believe Ukraine can win this war. I remain perhaps far too optimistic about this, and every day it is harder to say this, but I still believe that Ukraine can win this war. And we have to remember, or it depends on how you define winning. The strategy was always at the beginning to make Ukraine a porcupine, so that, to use that horrible euphemism, the Russian bear would choke. And that seems to be the case. That this is how the war will end eventually. I would like to see that Ukraine does push Russia back to its 1992 borders. That seems increasingly unlikely, but if it was to be able to do it to its 2014 borders, that would be a huge success. And I think that's still possible if the West does support Ukraine, and not just support Ukraine as it uses the slogan, but helps it win as quickly as possible. And that needs a sea change in terms of the West's thinking on Ukraine.
Speaking to journalists in the last week, President Zelensky conceded that this was the most difficult moment for unity, and that the third year of the war would be a turning point on which the format for the end of the war depends. There's an expected major Russian offensive, he says, in late May or early summer. How much time do you think Ukraine has to win on the terms it set out at the beginning?
Well, I mean, 2024 is going to be a very tough year for Ukraine, especially now we don't know what's happening in terms of who's going to win the American presidential election in November. We don't know, in fairness, who's going to win a lot of elections, obviously, in the West. So it depends on that. To a great extent, it's likely Russia will try a counteroffensive. It has its economy is on warp speed by Russian standards in terms of building up its munitions and how many munitions, how many drones it's providing. And Putin did allude to it, that they're on a 3 shifts a day producing munitions and various other weapons. The West, and let's be honest, Ukraine has nothing like that at the moment. So it is going to be a real challenge in terms of this year. And it does. 2024 probably will be a make or break year. If the West does support Ukraine, as it should, then it could change the situation. But it will need a lot of effort, and Western politicians do need to tell their electorate, we're in a war economy, we're at war. So, yeah.
And just finally, in the next 2 weeks ahead of the presidential elections in Russia, what do you expect to see coming out of Russia?
What do I expect to see coming out of Russia? I think that in terms of the election is a foregone conclusion. We know that Vladimir Putin will almost certainly, unless there's an act of God, be the president in 2024. So what I expect to see coming out of Russia is probably, I can't imagine that there will be any need to repress too much in terms of the opposition, because they're either already in jail or in exile. Yekaterina Donsova seems to have been not done away with, that's the wrong euphemism, but her party wasn't able to register. She's still trying to register her party. They tried to hold a congress and they were denied. The hotel claimed that they had a heating failure, but were still taking reservations. So they can't register the party for at least another month because of the law. So that's her sorted out. And what comes after that, I don't know, in terms of what they're going to try and crack down on. At the moment, the only real opposition are the Way Home group, the soldiers' wives and mothers. The regime has not found a way to deal with them yet. They're arresting journalists who advertise them, but they're not touching the women because they don't want to. Understandably, if the soldiers found out, they're unlikely to willingly fight for a regime that's just jailed their mother, wife, sister, what have you. So at the moment, I think there's very little that the regime necessarily needs to do. It's now a highly repressive autocracy. It has the capacity to maintain that, and short of a miracle, or an act of God, or the collapse of the economy, I can't imagine much is going to change in the next 2 weeks. I could be wrong. Predictions are always difficult as a political scientist because the day is a long time in politics.
Indeed. Dr. Stephen Hall, it's been great talking
Thank
to you.
you.
Thank you for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now or listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to today's producer, Morgan Burdick, and to you for watching. Bye-bye. Stephen, I've got a cat. It's just come into the room. She forced her way in and she's going to be on camera in a minute. Sorry, I'm just going to throw her out. Sorry. I heard the door opening about 20 minutes ago, and I've been keeping half an eye on her, and she's getting more and more in my face. I really apologise.